He wasn't invited. He wasn't expected. But he came. Not with words, not with flowers, but with paws covered in winter mud and eyes that had seen too much. A golden retriever. Old and scarred, walked into a child's funeral and refused to leave. He climbed atop the coffin like he belonged there, like he knew the boy inside. People gasped. Some wept. Others whispered, "Whose dog is that?" But no one had an answer. What he did next turned a quiet tragedy into a haunting question no one in town could ignore. Was it just grief? Or something far more? What happened next will break your heart, rebuild it, and make you believe in something greater. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe animals know, if you believe in miracles and second chances and love that never dies, hit subscribe. This story will stay with you long after the screen fades. Ashton Falls had never looked so quiet. The streets were glazed with a thin sheet of morning frost, and the old oak trees lining Maple Avenue stood still, their bare branches trembling under a gray, low-hanging sky. It was the kind of winter morning that muffled sound and emotion, as if the whole town was holding its breath. Snow flurries whispered across the sidewalks, dissolving on contact unnoticed by the few mourners gathered outside the town's modest chapel. Inside the walls of St. Miriam's Chapel were bathed in the soft golden light of flickering candles. Pew after pew was filled with silent faces, neighbors, teachers, children clutching their mothers' coats. They had come not out of obligation, but because they loved Ethan Carter, a boy who had smiled even when he was afraid, who had always offered the last cookie to someone else. At just 7 years old, Ethan had become a piece of Ashton Falls' heart. And now, he was gone. Hannah Carter, 37, sat in the front pew, back rigid, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her dark auburn hair was pulled back into a low knot, a few strands clinging to her tear-streaked face. She wore a simple black wool coat that made her look smaller than she was. Hannah was known in town for her independence, raising Ethan alone after her husband died in a factory accident just months before Ethan was born. She was a high school art teacher, the kind who gave quiet encouragement and painted side murals with her students. But today, the color had vanished from her world. Today, she was just a mother burying her child. The small white casket sat at the front of the room, almost surreal in its size. It was adorned with wildflowers, sunflowers, and dandelions, Ethan's favorites gathered despite the season. A framed photo rested on top, Ethan grinning, missing a front tooth, holding a paper dragon he'd made at school. Reverend Wallace, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with gentle eyes and a thinning crown of silver hair, stood at the pulpit. He began to speak about light, about the soul of a child who changed people just by being kind. But before he could finish his second sentence, a sound outside made everyone turn. At first, it was just a scratching at the wooden chapel doors, then a heavy thump. Someone muttered. Another person turned their head toward the back. Then the doors creaked open slowly, not pushed by human hands, but by a large golden shape nosing through. A golden retriever entered the chapel. His coat, once a lustrous honey gold, was dulled by age and streaked with pale gray around the muzzle and paws. His body bore small scars, some hidden beneath the fur, others more visible, each a story untold. He moved with intention but not fear, his steps slow and purposeful on the old floorboards. His name was Cooper. Gasps filled the air as Cooper walked straight down the aisle, ignoring whispers and calls. His amber eyes were locked on one thing, the small white casket at the front. "Whose dog is that?" someone asked in a whisper. "I thought all animals were supposed to be kept out," another murmured, but no one moved to stop him. "Not yet." Cooper reached the casket and paused, nostrils flaring. Then, in one slow, solemn motion, he rose on his hind legs and placed his front paws gently atop the coffin. His chest heaved as if he were breathing in Ethan's presence, and then he laid his head across the lid, eyes closed, body trembling but still. A collective hush fell over the chapel. Hannah stood abruptly, her chair scraping back. "Who brought that dog?" she demanded, voice cracked with grief. "Is this someone's idea of comfort?" No one responded. Cooper didn't move. "I want him out," she said again, quieter this time, but her voice broke at the end. Reverend Wallace approached gently, but before he could take Cooper's collar, the dog growled not loudly, but low and warning. A sound not of violence, but of protection. A sound that stopped the Reverend cold. In the back of the room, a tall man in his late 50s stood quietly. His name was Raymond Hale, mayor of Ashton Falls. He was a broad-shouldered man with a military stiffness in posture and salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp. He wore a dark wool coat over a worn Army-issued sweater, his hands folded in front of him. Hale had served in Afghanistan as a logistics officer back when men came home with both scars and secrets. Raymond's eyes were fixed on Cooper. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the dog, something he couldn't quite place, and then it struck him not the face, but the way the dog moved. Controlled. Observant. Not like a pet, but like a soldier. He stepped forward and knelt a few feet away from the dog, watching. Cooper didn't react to him, only remained curled around the coffin, unmoving, silent. "That's not a stray," Raymond murmured. "That dog's trained." Someone in the back chimed in. "I think I saw him near the veterans' compound last year. He used to belong to one of the handlers, I think. A guy who passed." Reverend Wallace looked toward Hannah for guidance. She had sunk back into her seat, watching Cooper with eyes filled not just with grief now, but confusion. And something deeper. Recognition. The funeral continued haltingly, tenderly, while Cooper stayed by Ethan's side. By the end, no one asked him to leave. That night, after all the mourners had gone, Hannah returned to the cemetery. Snow had started to fall again, soft and clean. She clutched Ethan's small mittens in her coat pocket and walked toward the fresh mound of earth. The wind howled gently through the pines. Cooper was already there, lying on the snow beside the grave, unmoving. She stood there for a long time, watching him. Eventually, he looked up. His eyes met hers, not pleading, not even sad, just present, as though to say, "I remember him too." The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving Ashton Falls wrapped in a glistening hush. The town square, with its antique lampposts and bricked sidewalks, still bore traces of candlelight from the vigil held the night before. Hannah Carter hadn't slept. She sat at the edge of her bed, wrapped in Ethan's old flannel blanket, her fingers curled tightly around the corner like it was a lifeline. She had woken at 3:12 a.m., the exact minute her son's heart monitor had flatlined in the emergency room. Ever since that night, her body seemed to remember, even if her mind tried not to. What she couldn't explain was why she found herself standing outside the cemetery gate, boots crunching the thin crust of snow drawn by something she didn't want to name. Cooper was already there. The golden retriever lay curled beside Ethan's grave, his body still nose pressed gently against the carved name on the headstone. His breath fogged the air in soft puffs. The faint wind moved through his fur like fingers through memory. Hannah watched from a distance, arms crossed. The rational part of her mind screamed this was absurd. She didn't know this dog. She didn't invite him. He had no right. But something deeper, some aching part of her no longer interested in logic, kept her from turning away. She walked forward slowly. Cooper didn't stir. "Why are you here?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Why can't I stop coming back here too?" The dog lifted his head and looked at her. There was nothing dramatic in the moment, no sudden bark, no leap of recognition. just quiet eyes filled with something that felt like memory. He let out a soft whine and lowered his head again. She sat down next to him, legs folded under her, the cold biting through her coat. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. The next morning, Hannah drove to the sheriff's department. She needed answers, or at least someone to blame. Cooper had no collar, no tags. Whoever let a dog roam like this, especially around a child's grave, had to answer for it. Sheriff Dean Murphy stood behind the front desk reviewing paperwork. A man in his early 60s, broad-shouldered, with a salt and pepper beard and deep crow's feet that made his expression look perpetually tired. He had been sheriff of Ashton Falls for over 20 years, and though not quick to comfort, he had always been fair. "I need to know who owns that dog," Hannah said without preamble. Murphy looked up slowly. "You mean the golden retriever from the funeral?" She nodded. "I've asked around. No one's claimed him. He's not chipped either. So he's a stray, I don't think so." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "One of my deputies said the way he moved reminded him of a service dog. Might have belonged to someone in the military. Could have been released or abandoned after his handler passed." "Why would a dog like that come to Ethan's funeral?" She asked, the words catching in her throat. Murphy didn't answer, just gave her a long, searching look. "You want me to try and have him picked up?" Hannah hesitated. "No," she said finally. "Not yet." Elsewhere in town, at the corner of Willow and Main, the door to the Ashton Falls Public Library creaked open. Lauren Pierce stepped inside, shaking the cold from her coat. She was 29 tall, with sharp cheekbones and a mass of curly dark hair, often pulled into a low bun. Her boots were still dusted with Manhattan street grit, though she'd been in Ashton Falls for 3 weeks. A journalist by trade, Lauren had returned to her late aunt's hometown after the New York paper she worked for laid off half its staff. She hadn't expected to find a story here. But the scene at Ethan's funeral, the dog, the tension, the whispers hadn't left her mind. Lauren approached the front desk where an older librarian named Jean sat cataloging donations. "I'm looking for any archived records about a man named Gary Bell," Lauren said. "He was the driver in the accident that killed Ethan Carter." Jean, a woman with rimless glasses and perfectly arranged gray hair, blinked in surprise, but didn't question her. "Accident reports are in the back. You'll need the microfiche reader." Lauren spent the next 3 hours digging. Newspaper clippings, public accident reports, traffic citations. She noted something curious. Gary Bell had been a long-haul truck driver for over 15 years, but his record wasn't spotless. Minor infractions, missed inspections, speeding in rural zones. But what made her pause was a separate incident from 9 years ago involving a missing girl named Callie Monroe. Bell had been the last person to see her before she disappeared. He had claimed to have given her a ride to a summer camp a few towns over. Police never proved otherwise, and no charges were filed. The case went cold. Lauren leaned back in her chair, staring at the faded image of Bell's deposition. Her instincts stirred. Meanwhile, that night, Hannah returned to the cemetery. Cooper was there again. This time, she brought him a wool blanket and placed it beside the grave. He sniffed it, then gently pawed it into place before settling on top. It was the first night she whispered her son's name aloud since the funeral. The next morning, she found herself waiting at the cemetery gate with a leash in her coat pocket. The air over Ashton Falls had warmed slightly, just enough to coax a few puddles from the snowbanks and bring the scent of wet earth to the breeze. Hannah noticed it that morning as she stepped outside, leash in hand, watching Cooper sniff the wind with alert eyes. For a dog supposedly abandoned, he moved with too much purpose. That thought had haunted her ever since he first lay down beside Ethan's grave like he belonged there more than anyone else. But today he didn't head to the cemetery. Today he tugged the leash toward the south end of town, where the pavement gave way to dirt, and the woods whispered stories no one else seemed to hear. Cooper, with his strong, muscular frame and once lustrous golden coat now faded in patches, walked with a steady gait. He was older, at least 9, maybe 10, but every move hinted at training discipline memory. He glanced back at Hannah every few steps as if to say, "Trust me." Hannah followed. They crossed the park where Ethan used to fly his paper kites, then passed the wooden footbridge near Willow Creek. Hannah hadn't been to this side of town in weeks. The quiet stung. Memories clung to the rustling trees like frost to window panes. Cooper finally paused near the edge of the forest, tail stiff ears forward. He circled a patch of dry grass near a fallen log, then looked at Hannah expectantly. "What is it?" she asked, breath visible in the cold. She approached, crouched down, and brushed aside the frost-covered leaves. Her hand stopped mid-motion. There, partially buried in dirt and damp needles, was a small keychain, green plastic cracked at the edges with white letters that spelled out ETHAN. Her breath caught. She stared at it as if it might vanish if she blinked. Ethan had carried that keychain everywhere. It had once been clipped to his backpack zipper. She'd noticed it missing the day of the accident, but assumed it had been lost in the chaos. She looked around. The road wasn't visible from here. No houses nearby. It didn't make sense. "This isn't where it happened," she whispered. The official police report stated Ethan had been struck crossing Hawthorne Lane 2 blocks from their home. A straight road, decent visibility. Gary Bell, the truck driver, claimed he didn't see the boy until it was too late. But this was the opposite direction. Ethan never walked this far alone unless he wasn't alone. Hannah clutched the keychain tightly in her palm. Cooper sat beside her, watching her face like he understood the storm building behind her eyes. Later that day, she returned to the spot with her phone and took pictures. She didn't yet know who to send them to. Elsewhere in the Ashton Falls Library, Lauren Pierce leaned over a dusty binder marked Town Records, 2013. Her cheeks were flushed from the walkover, and her hair, usually tied neatly, hung loose around her face. She hadn't planned to become obsessed with the case, but it had crept into her like fog into bone. Every time she tried to sleep, she saw the dog's face, heard the stillness in Hannah's voice. She flipped through pages of old police blotters until one headline caught her attention. "Search continues for missing girl 11. The name was Cassie Dalton. Disappeared from a neighboring town during a school camping trip. The year 2013. The same year Cooper had reportedly retired from military service. Her fingers trembled slightly as she scanned the article. Cassie had last been seen near the Pine Hollow trails about 30 miles from Ashton Falls. A few months later, search dogs had been deployed from a joint military-civilian task force. The records mentioned one canine by name, Cooper, SAR certified K9 U.S. Army, retired to civilian search unit, post-tour. Lauren sat back, mind racing. The pieces were connecting, even if they didn't form a clear picture yet. She jotted notes in her leather-bound journal and then made a decision. She printed the article and walked straight to the sheriff's department. Dean Murphy looked up from his desk, the same exhausted lines under his eyes, same half-skeptical smile. "I need to talk to you," Lauren said, setting the article down in front of him. "This dog Cooper, he was part of a missing persons search team in 2013. Murphy scanned the paper. So Cassie Dalton went missing 30 miles from here, and the trail went cold. What if Cooper picked up something connected to that? Something that led him here? Lauren?" He sighed, pushing the article aside. "I respect what you're trying to do. I do. But the Carter boys' case is closed. We ran every test. The autopsy matched the scene. Gary Bell passed a field sobriety test. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. And yet the dog keeps going back to the woods." He led Hannah to something she wasn't supposed to find. She pressed. "Are you even slightly curious?" Murphy hesitated, then shook his head. Sometimes grief makes people look for meaning where there isn't any. Lauren left frustrated but more determined. If the sheriff wouldn't dig deeper, she would. Back at home, Hannah sat at the kitchen table, the keychain lying on a folded napkin like evidence at a crime scene. She didn't tell anyone about it. Not yet. Instead, she opened Ethan's old sketch pad and traced the outline of the keychain, her fingers trembling. Cooper lay under the table, head resting on his front paws. Occasionally, he looked up at her tail, thumping once against the floor. It was as if he were waiting not just for her to act, but to believe. The days in Ashton Falls were growing longer, but the cold refused to loosen its grip. Ice still rimmed the sidewalks, and a layer of frost kissed every window pane like the breath of something waiting in silence. Hannah Carter sat on her front porch, bundled in a thick navy parka, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. She didn't drink it for the warmth that had long since gone cold, but as something to hold on to. Cooper sat beside her, upright and alert, eyes trained on the road as if waiting for something or someone. He had begun to act differently. It wasn't just his nightly visits to the grave anymore. Now, every morning at precisely 7:10, Cooper would stand at the edge of the property, ears forward, staring in the direction of Maple Row, specifically toward a rundown white house with peeling shutters and a sunken porch. The house belonged to Gary Bell. Gary was in his early 60s, a wiry man with sun-weathered skin, a faded ball cap seemingly stapled to his balding head, and a permanent scowl carved into his face like it had been left there by time. He worked part-time hauling lumber for a nearby mill, lived alone, and rarely made conversation with anyone in town except to complain. He'd been the driver in Ethan's accident. That morning, Gary stepped onto his porch to light a cigarette. As he caught Cooper's gaze, the golden retriever growled a low, guttural sound that didn't stop until Gary flicked his cigarette into the snow and went back inside. Hannah's hand trembled slightly as she set down her coffee. At first, she'd thought the behavior was coincidence. But the third time it happened, then the fourth, she began to feel it deep in her gut. Cooper wasn't afraid of Gary Bell. He was warning her. Later that day, Hannah walked the path through the woods again. Cooper led the way without hesitation, stopping only once to glance back and make sure she was still following. They reached the spot where the keychain had been found. She'd already memorized every inch of the clearing, had taken more photos, and even measured the distance to the road using her phone's pedometer. It was too far for a child to wander to alone without someone noticing. And yet Ethan's keychain had been there. Not near the site of the supposed accident. Not anywhere near where Gary Bell had claimed he'd struck the boy. That lie, she realized now, had been accepted too easily. Cooper sniffed the base of a nearby pine, his posture stiffening again. Then he walked deeper into the trees, stopping near a splintered section of fence. Beneath a pile of wet leaves, he pawed until a small object clinked against a rock. It was a toy car. Blue scratched at the edges, one of the tiny matchbox ones Ethan used to keep in his coat pocket. Her knees buckled. Back in town, Lauren Pierce was hunched over the microfilm reader at the Ashton Falls Library, flipping through archived police logs. Her hair was pulled into a messy braid, and the lenses of her reading glasses reflected the dim screen. She hadn't told anyone, not even Hannah, about what she'd found the night before. The file had been tucked away, barely legible. Subject Dana Kessler, age 10. Disappearance recorded June 12, 2014. Last seen leaving community pool. Primary witness Gary Bell, long-haul driver in vicinity of pool delivery. No charges filed. The parallels were chilling. Dana's body was never found. Gary had been questioned, then released. His alibi had come from a dispatcher, not an eyewitness. Lauren printed the file and took it to Sheriff Dean Murphy that afternoon. The sheriff, seated at his usual desk with a battered thermos beside him, looked up as she approached. "I need 5 minutes," she said, setting the paper down with more force than she meant to. Murphy mid-sip sighed and leaned forward. "I found another case with Gary Bell's name on it," she said. "This one from 9 years ago. A girl named Dana Kessler. He was the last to see her." Murphy raised an eyebrow, scanning the faded text. "We have no jurisdiction on this. That was handled by the Franklin County Police. But it's a pattern," Lauren pressed. "He lied about the accident with Ethan. Cooper found evidence away from the official scene." "You can't tell me it's nothing." Murphy leaned back, his jaw tightening. "Even if it's suspicious, suspicion doesn't make a case. So you're saying you won't follow up?" "I'm saying," he said slowly, "this department has been sued once already this decade for mishandling evidence. I'm not going to reopen a closed file without proof that won't get thrown out in court." Lauren stood up, frustration clenching her throat. "You'd rather protect protocol than a child's truth." Back at the edge of the woods, Hannah sat on a tree stump, the tiny blue car clutched in her hand. Cooper lay at her feet, ears still hightail wrapped tightly around himself. The silence felt heavy. "Why didn't I listen?" before she murmured. "Why did I let them tell me it was an accident?" She held the car close to her heart, the snow beginning to fall again in slow, deliberate flakes. For the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to believe it. Ethan didn't die where they said he did. And Cooper had been trying to tell her all along. The forest had thawed just enough to let the wind whisper between the trees like a warning. Above, patches of blue peeked through a restless sky, while below the ground held onto winter in the form of muddy trails and brittle leaves. The deeper into the woods they went, the quieter it became, as if even the birds knew better than to speak here. Hannah walked beside Lauren in silence, her boots crunching over dead twigs. She kept her eyes fixed on Cooper, who padded ahead with calm precision, nose low, ears forward. His thick golden coat rippled as he weaved through underbrush, stopping occasionally to check they were still following. Lauren had come dressed for the field cargo jacket, wool beanie-worn jeans, camera slung over her shoulder. Her usual city polish was replaced by something leaner, more focused. There was fire in her eyes, the kind that had once won her bylines on the front page in Manhattan, and now burned with something far more personal. "I still can't believe you didn't tell, Murphy," Hannah murmured, clutching her coat tighter. "I'm done waiting for permission," Lauren said flatly. "This town's been quiet for too long. And quiet isn't the same as clean." Cooper stopped. Before them stood a birch tree, tall, slender bark, pale as bone and peeling like parchment. Its branches curved like arms, reaching upward, and beneath its roots, the ground formed a natural hollow covered by decaying leaves and clumps of moss. Cooper barked once, short, sharp, then began to dig. Hannah moved closer every step, like walking into a nightmare she could no longer pretend wasn't real. The soil was loose, disturbed, but not recently. After a few moments, Cooper stopped and stepped back, his chest rising and falling in short, shallow breaths. He looked at Hannah and whined. Lauren crouched down and brushed away the remaining dirt. It was a teddy bear, or what remained of one. The fur was once a soft cream, but now matted and dirty, streaked with something unmistakably dark brown blood, dried and oxidized to a rusted red. One glass eye was missing. Its neck had been partially torn. Pinned beneath it, tangled among brittle roots, were several strands of hair, fine, light brown, and long. Hannah's legs folded under her. "It's his," she whispered. That was Ethan's bear. He called it Buddy. She hadn't seen the bear since the hospital. The police had returned only his shoes and backpack, which had been found neatly folded by the curb. They'd said everything else must have been damaged in the accident. She'd believed them. She had to. Lauren gently picked up the bear using the corner of her scarf. "We need this tested," she said. Hannah didn't answer. She was staring at Cooper, who had laid down beside the tree, resting his head near the toy as if standing watch. Her throat tightened. "He's not just a dog." "No," Lauren said. "He's a witness." Neither of them noticed the man in the distance. Raymond Hale stood behind a thicket of pine just 50 yards away. Binoculars held to his eyes, one gloved hand gripping the trunk of a tree. The mayor of Ashton Falls was tall and broad, with graying hair combed neatly back and a square jaw that betrayed his years in the army. He wore his usual wool trench coat and leather gloves not out of vanity but muscle memory. His presence commanded a room, even one without walls. He wasn't supposed to be out here, not officially, but Cooper had caught his attention ever since the funeral. Not just because of the commotion or the way the dog had remained silent until Ethan's name was spoken, but because he recognized the behavior. It was a pattern he hadn't seen since Kandahar. Back then, he'd been part of a military surveillance unit working with K-9s trained to detect bodies in collapsed buildings after drone strikes. Cooper had been one of those dogs he remembered the name. Remembered his handler, too. Private McAllister, who'd disappeared under questionable circumstances. After the incident, Cooper had been pulled from the field and reassigned to domestic SAR duty. The report was buried. Raymond only knew because he'd seen the paperwork and chosen to look away. But now, the dog was back. And this time, he wasn't deployed by command. He had deployed himself. From the shadows, Raymond watched as Hannah gathered the bear and Lauren took photos of the site. He knew what would come next: forensic tests, public questions, whispers in the council meetings. If Cooper's actions became public, they might reopen everything. Not just Ethan's case, Dana's, Cassie's, maybe even McAllister's. Raymond pulled out a small recorder from his coat and clicked it off. He would review the footage later. For now, he stepped back into the trees, leaving no prints behind. Back at Hannah's, she sat on the porch holding the bear wrapped in an old dish towel. Cooper lay at her feet, eyes half closed but always aware. Lauren sat beside her, reviewing the images on her camera. The hair had already been placed in a sealed bag. She'd mail it to a lab she still had contacts with in New York. Quietly, discreetly. "You know this doesn't end here," Lauren said softly. "I know," Hannah replied, "but it had to start somewhere. And under the birch tree where silence once lived, something had finally spoken." It was a clear morning in Ashton Falls, the kind that almost fooled you into thinking winter was behind you. Sunlight spilled across the cemetery like it had something to prove, casting long shadows from rows of white marble stones. A light wind stirred through the pine trees, carrying the scent of old leaves and distant smoke. A small crowd had gathered under a blue canopy tent near the southeastern edge, another funeral, another farewell. But today it wasn't the ceremony that would be remembered. It was what followed. The Iron Oaks arrived just before the eulogy began. They came in quiet formation, 6 riders, leather vests patched with the group's acorn emblem chrome glinting in the sun. The roar of engines faded into solemn respect as they dismounted and removed their helmets. They weren't a gang. They were veterans, volunteers. They escorted fallen soldiers to their rest, not with salutes but with silent presence. Travis Maddox was the tallest among them, broad-shouldered and sunburned with close-cropped dark hair graying at the temples. His face was weather-worn, but his eyes were clear alert and still held the sharpness of someone who had once seen too much. On his forearm was a faded tattoo, an eagle with a broken wing. He carried no flowers, only a folded flag tucked beneath his arm. When he saw Cooper standing at the edge of the funeral crowd beside Hannah and Lauren, he stopped cold. "That dog," he whispered, stepping forward. Hannah turned as Travis approached slowly, his hand unconsciously rising to his chest like muscle memory. Cooper's ears twitched. He turned, studied Travis, and gave a short, quiet bark, something between recognition and acknowledgement. Travis knelt. "His name's Cooper," Hannah said cautiously, uncertain of this man's sudden emotion. "No," Travis said. Voice-hoarse eyes locked on the golden retriever. His name was Bravo 9. Kandahar, 2010. "He pulled me out of a collapsed radio post after the mortar hit." Lauren leaned in. "You're sure it's him? I'd know that walk anywhere," Travis murmured. "He has a scar just above the left paw, see it? That happened in the same explosion, And the way he watches everything like he's scanning, always ready. That's not just instinct. That's training. Hannah's hand hovered near Cooper's collar. We were told he was retired from SAR. Travis stood, his jaw tightening. That's a half-truth. This dog wasn't just search and rescue. He was trauma-trained, scent-specific. He was part of a classified program to identify emotional response from perpetrators. Lauren's brow furrowed. Meaning he could alert to danger, not just bombs or bodies, but the emotional residue of aggression. Rage, fear, guilt. Travis exhaled. He only reacts like that when someone has caused harm. Hannah exchanged a look with Lauren. He's been growling at Gary Bell every time he sees him. Then your instincts are probably right, Travis said. Later that afternoon, the three of them stood behind the local diner in a narrow alley where Gary Bell's truck had been parked. It was a rust-colored 1999 Dodge Ram with a dented front bumper and chipped blue license plate. The windows were tinted and the truck bed was covered with a tarp pulled taut and strapped down. No one else was around. I can get us in, Travis said, producing a pair of latex gloves from his vest pocket. Don't ask why I carry these. Lauren chuckled dryly. I won't if you don't ask why I have a forensic swab kit in my glove compartment. With practiced hands, Travis popped the lock and opened the door. A sharp, metallic odor seeped into the air. Rust oil, something else beneath it. Cooper stepped forward, his stance shifting in an instant. The calm, observant dog became taut, head low, tail rigid. He growled a deep, pulsing sound that vibrated through the alley. He moved to the truck bed, placed both paws on the tailgate, and sniffed hard at the tarp. Lauren slipped on gloves and lifted the corner. Tucked behind a box of chains and a gas canister was a ragged piece of stained fabric. Wait, she murmured. This looks like... She didn't finish. Instead, she took a sample of the dried material and sealed it in a tube. Can you run it with the lab that tested the bear? Hannah asked. Lauren nodded. They owe me a favor. Travis looked down at Cooper, who was still growling low in his throat, eyes locked on the fabric. He's confirming what you already suspected. They returned the truck to how it was and left silently. That night, Travis joined them at Hannah's house. The atmosphere was subdued. Lauren typed notes while Cooper paced in front of the living room window, still uneasy. Hannah brought out tea, though Travis barely touched his. He sat on the floor next to Cooper, resting a hand on the dog's back. I owe him my life, Travis said quietly. There was no one else who could have found me in time. When they said he was being retired, I tried to adopt him, but he'd already been reassigned. They classified it under psychological use testing. Sounded fancy, but they just meant he was too sensitive for normal duty. Hannah looked at Cooper. Sensitive. He reacts to unresolved violence, Travis said. If he growled at that man, that means there's a trace on him. Cooper can't forget. Lauren's phone buzzed. She read the text, her expression changing. It's back, she said. Lab confirmed it. Blood sample from the tarp matches the DNA on the bear. Hannah sank into her chair. That's enough for a warrant, Lauren added. Travis stood slowly. Then I think it's time someone made sure this town listens. The courthouse of Ashton Falls wasn't grand. Built of pale limestone and red brick, it sat modestly at the end of a cobblestone road lined with maple trees now dressed in the golds and oranges of October. But on the morning of Gary Bell's hearing, the building felt like the center of the world. Reporters had begun to gather outside the steps since dawn, their breath forming pale clouds in the chilly air, microphones poised and cameras humming. Inside, the mood was tense. Hannah sat near the front of the courtroom bench, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed ahead. She wore a navy wool coat, and her hair was pulled back, revealing the pale lines beneath her eyes, the kind only grief can carve. Next to her sat Lauren, notebook in hand, though she hadn't written a single word since they arrived. Her expression was unreadable, save for a subtle crease between her brows. At Hannah's feet, Cooper lay calmly, but his body was alert. The golden retriever's amber eyes moved with every shift in the room, ears twitching, tail still. He was freshly groomed for court, a deep blue service vest across his shoulders, embroidered with his new title, Certified Emotional Alert K9, Witness Companion. But Cooper wasn't here for comfort today. He was here for justice. Judge Elizabeth Morin presided over the case. A tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair clipped into a low bun, she was known across the county for her no-nonsense demeanor and razor-sharp clarity. Her gaze swept the room as the proceedings began. Gary Bell entered, flanked by his lawyer, a stocky man in a charcoal suit. Gary himself looked haggard, his usual smug confidence replaced with a kind of blank fatigue. He was in his early 50s, heavy-set with thinning hair and a slight limp. As he took his seat at the defendant's table, Cooper growled. It was low, controlled, but unmistakable. There was a stir in the courtroom. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She placed a gentle hand on Cooper's back, not to silence him, but to remind herself this was real. Beside her, Lauren's eyes narrowed. Judge Morin leaned forward. Is that the animal in question? A woman stood from the prosecution's table. Dr. Allison Varga, a renowned animal behaviorist called to testify, nodded. She was in her 40s, tall and lean, with a calm, deliberate presence. Her gray slacks and soft brown blazer made her appear more like a university professor than an expert witness. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "This is Cooper. I've evaluated his behavior over the last 4 weeks under controlled and observed environments, and the purpose of his presence to present a behavioral demonstration. Cooper is a retired military support dog with specialized training in scent memory and emotional response identification. While he cannot testify in the human sense, his reactions are documented and have previously supported legal findings in trauma-linked cases." There was a pause. Then Judge Morin nodded once. "Proceed." The courtroom dimmed as a video was cued on a large screen beside the jury. It had been taken a week prior in a controlled setting. Gary Bell had been brought into a scent-neutral chamber. Cooper had entered moments later. The footage showed the dog stiffen immediately upon catching Gary's scent, then begin a series of escalating behaviors, hackled fur pacing, growling, retreating, and reapproaching, and finally issuing a specific alert bark, identical to the one recorded at the forest site where Ethan's bear had been found. In the courtroom, Cooper did the same now. He did not look at the screen. He looked at Gary. Dr. Varga faced the jury. In all control conditions against neutral individuals, strangers, and town residents, Cooper displayed no reaction. Only in the presence of Mr. Bell did he exhibit repeated trauma-linked behavioral alerts. Based on his training history and neurological assessments, this indicates recognition of Mr. Bell's scent as associated with a harmful or traumatic event. The defense attorney rose. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we're being asked to believe a dog's instincts over documented testimony." Judge Morin replied without hesitation. "And yet, this dog's instincts have led to the discovery of new physical evidence corroborated by forensic labs. Continue, Doctor." As the session progressed, other testimonies followed. Travis Maddox confirming Cooper's military background and scent reactive training lab experts confirming DNA from Gary's truck matched blood found on the teddy bear. But it was Cooper's presence that kept the room taut with unspoken weight. Hannah didn't speak during the trial. She didn't have to. Her presence next to Cooper said enough. By noon, the prosecution rested. As the judge called for a recess, Lauren stepped outside to take a breath. Her phone buzzed. A message from a New York publisher blinked across the screen. "Your story has weight. Consider writing it, The Dog That Wouldn't Let Go. We'll back it all the way." She stared at it for a long moment. Then she hit delete. Hannah joined her on the steps, tucking her scarf tighter. "They offered you a deal?" she asked, her tone light but knowing. Lauren nodded. "A book. National distribution." I said no. Why? Lauren looked back toward the courthouse doors. "Because if I leave now, I'm just another byline. But here, I can actually finish something. Something that matters." They stood in silence, the wind rising between them. It was early autumn again in Ashton Falls, and the hills above the town were aglow with fields of golden wildflowers, their delicate petals swaying in the crisp morning breeze. The light was gentle, almost reverent, casting long amber shadows across the familiar slope where Ethan used to run laughing through the tall grass. At the very top of the hill stood a simple white bench, and beside it a stone marker, small, smooth, etched with a child's name and a photograph preserved under glass. In the picture, Ethan Carter grinned his front tooth, missing eyes lit up with joy. Cooper lay beside the marker paws, crossed, head raised slightly but relaxed, as if he were still watching over the boy who once held his leash. He was older now, nearly 10, with silver creeping into the soft golden fur around his muzzle, but his posture retained that quiet vigilance, the unspoken loyalty that had never wavered, even when the world around him had changed. Hannah sat on the bench, wrapped in a slate-blue cardigan, her chestnut hair tied loosely, a few strands fluttering against her cheek. A small bouquet of wild daisies rested in her lap. She placed them gently at the base of the stone and whispered, "We're doing okay, sweet boy. We're doing okay." In the months since the trial, Hannah's life had transformed not with fanfare, but with quiet, deliberate purpose. Cooper had never left her side. After the case closed and the court granted Gary Bell's sentence, she had filed to adopt Cooper officially. The process took weeks with paperwork and vet visits and approvals from animal welfare and service dog agencies. But when the final signature cleared, the woman who had once wanted nothing more than to shut the world out became the proud guardian of a dog who had already saved her twice. Together, they had channeled their grief into something larger. Ethan's light began as an idea written on the back of a grocery list. Now, 1 year later, it had grown into a nonprofit with a rented office near Main Street, 2 part-time counselors, a volunteer network, and a mission to provide support, legal aid, and trauma resources to families who had lost children under suspicious or traumatic circumstances. Cooper was the heart of it all. He came to every outreach event, every school visit, every therapy group. Children with autism hugged him during their sessions. Grieving parents found comfort in the weight of his head on their laps. His calm presence turned fear into trust. No one questioned how a dog could change the air in a room just by walking in. There was a new addition to the team as well. Sarah Delgado, the organization's lead therapist, had moved from Chicago after reading about the trial. She was in her early 40s, medium build, with a confident gait and warm olive skin, eyes the color of dark tea. Sarah had spent a decade working in pediatric trauma recovery before burnout forced her to step away. She was quiet with adults, but had a gift with children, kneeling to their level, offering silence instead of questions, presence instead of platitudes. She and Cooper had taken to one another immediately. "It's like he knows what I don't say," she told Hannah once after a particularly emotional intake session. "He does that," Hannah replied, not needing to explain further. Today, Sarah was setting up for the Foundation's 1-year celebration event. Folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle at the community park, a white tent covering a long table filled with memory stones painted by families who had lost children. Each stone bore a name, a color, a symbol, tiny legacies etched by hand. On a banner strung between 2 trees were the words, "Light always finds a way." Lauren stood near the refreshments table, helping a young intern arrange stacks of books and pamphlets. She was still living in Ashton Falls now, working as a regional investigative journalist for a justice initiative founded in part through donations inspired by Cooper's case. Her hair was longer, always pulled into a messy braid. She still wore her signature black jacket, now patched at the elbow from so many days in the field. Occasionally, someone recognized her from a podcast interview or article, but she always waved it off. "This isn't my story," she'd say. "It's his." She pointed at Cooper every time. That morning, a group of fourth graders from Ashton Elementary arrived with their teacher, Mrs. Bloom, a petite woman with graying curls and a spark of mischief behind her reading glasses. They sat cross-legged on the grass as Sarah spoke softly about bravery, about love, and how sometimes it comes on four legs. Cooper padded forward slowly, then lowered himself beside a small boy who sat apart from the group, his arms wrapped around his knees. Without a sound, Cooper rested his chin on the boy's ankle. The child glanced down, eyes widened, then reached out with hesitant fingers. Within minutes, he was smiling. No one needed to explain. Cooper had already spoken. After the event, Hannah and Lauren walked together up the hill. The sun was lower now, casting golden halos on the field. At the top, they sat near Ethan's grave while Cooper lay nearby. "You know, Lauren said I used to think the word miracle was just poetic marketing, but not anymore." Hannah smiled her fingers, tracing the edge of the stone. "I think sometimes God doesn't speak in thunder or lightning. Sometimes he sends a golden dog who won't give up." Lauren looked over at Cooper, still guarding him. "Always will. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or a shining light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly on four paws, with amber eyes and a heart full of loyalty." Cooper wasn't just a dog. He was a messenger, a guardian, a silent voice that refused to let a tragedy be buried. Through him, the truth surfaced, justice prevailed, and a mother's broken heart began to heal. In our everyday lives, we often rush past the small signs, the quiet nudges, the gentle pull of something greater, reminding us to slow down, to listen, to care. This story reminds us that love doesn't die, and hope isn't lost, not when there's faith, not when we believe in something more. Whether you call it God, fate, or grace, there are forces in this world that work beyond understanding. If you believe that every child deserves justice, that every soul, human or animal, deserves to be heard, then share this story. Let Cooper's legacy be more than memory. Let it be a movement. Type Amen in the comments if you believe love never ends. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and uplift the spirit. And may God bless you and your family with peace, with courage, and with miracles in your own journey.